you push
Okay.
it.
Now it's recording.
Now it's working? Okay, good. So, I'm going to speak to the people that are watching online first of all. Remember, if you want to get extra credit from watching the video, this video right now, take notes and include time signatures. So look at the little time bar on the bottom and write down, like, at a minute 30, this is what you talked about. 3 minutes, this is what you talked about. Do that fairly frequently. There's not a set number of things you have to do, but just make sure you do that, okay? So, everybody else, take-home essays due on Friday. You show up, hand that in. What else do you have to have with the take-home essay? The abstract from the peer-reviewed journal article. Any one that you want, it doesn't matter, okay? Now, turn that in when you get to the test. The test is 100 questions. The first 50 questions are matching in groups of 10. So those are kind of a little bit of everything all mixed together. For example, some of the concepts that get discussed are Mead's view on socialization, where he talked about the generalized and significant other. What does the generalized other mean? What is the generalized other? What is the generalized other?
Like when you say something like that.
There you go. So, generalized, the way I think of this is the general person or the average person. You're trying to figure out what to do. You think in your mind, what would the average person in society do? Whether it's going to college, getting married, getting a job, whatever, that to you would be the generalized other. So how does that differ from the significant other? What's the significant other then? A specific person that plays an important role in socialization, such as your parents, your best friend, your brother, your sister, your children even, just somebody that you learn a lot from that affects you a lot. The other thing with this process of growing up, socialization, it's lifelong. It doesn't end. So that's a key concept as well, okay? We also talked about different types of functions. Remember, from a functionalist view, a function is something that gets accomplished in society or the purpose of action in society. So if we change something, if we're the government, we change something, or we're a school, we change something, and we think if we change this thing, it'll lead to this. And that's actually what happens. What type of function is that? What type of function is that? If I'm like, here's what I want to change, and then it changes.
Cause and effect.
Yeah, what's the term for that though? No. So the book definition for it is the recognized intended consequences of a social action. Manifest function. Yep. If it's unintended, what's that an example of? Latent function. And then the other way that functionalists will look at things like that is a social dysfunction. Okay. So latent functions do not always have to be bad. They're just unintended. So we use school as an example. A manifest function of school is so that you all learn, right? A latent function of school is that you meet a lot of friends that you hang out with in school, right? So that's not a bad thing, but it's not the main purpose of school. And then dysfunctions, again, is anything that's a consequence that disrupts the operation of society. We also talked about the 5 elements of culture. 5 elements of culture. And somebody give me one of those. Values. Norms, beliefs. Symbols, and language. Good. What is the difference between values and beliefs? What's the main difference between values and beliefs?
Beliefs that they hold individuals or values they
Beliefs are more specific. So the example that the text gives, and I think an example I gave in class also was beauty. So the United States has a value of beauty, but what different people believe is beautiful differs, right? So you ask the average guy, he's trying to find a date, do you want to find somebody that you perceive as attractive? Average guy is going to say yes. Okay, that's a value. Then you ask the guy, okay, do you find taller girls or shorter girls or blondes or brunettes or whatever attractive? That's a belief, the specifics. Okay. We also talked about norms. You can break down norms simplistically in the difference between folkways and mores. So which one's stronger, folkways or mores? Mores are stronger. How do you tell which one's stronger? By how people react to it, exactly. We also talked about something that's called anticipatory socialization. Anticipatory socialization, what does that do? Or what is that? What's anticipatory socialization?
That girl made it up.
Somebody made it up?
Didn't the girl create it?
I don't know if the gender of the theorist that came up with that idea. Yeah, Gilligan talked about socialization, but I don't think she coined the term anticipatory. But what that is it's behavior that helps you to kind of practice and attain a different social status, basically. So the text definition might be a little bit different than that, but in essence, it's you act like people that you want to be like later in the future, and that helps you to socialize for a future role that you're not part of. So playing house, all the kids at the football games that play football, like south of the field, right? Anticipatory socialization. Okay? Now, in the matching sections, there's also a lot of people. I'd say there's probably a dozen people, and you basically have to identify the person with what they came up with. So let's talk about the three main theories a little bit, and then I'll talk about people related to it. Functionalism and conflict theory, are those macro or micro perspectives? Macro, which means it's big picture down. What's the other of the three main theories? Symbolic interaction. Good. So, functionalists basically look at society as an organism or a machine where different social institutions, like businesses or education or the media or whatever, where those things have a purpose or a function that they have to carry out. Okay? So that's a functionalist viewpoint. From a conflict viewpoint, they believe that structures exist because the people that have power control those structures to keep themselves in power at the expense of everybody else. And then SI theorists believe that the key to understanding society is looking at how individuals interpret their different interactions. So one of the first theorists in sociology that understood how social forces affected people's choices was Emil Durkheim. What did Durkheim study specifically? Suicide rates. And Durkheim found that the key variable for suicide rates was what?
Males.
Social integration. So the more integration or connectedness you have with others, the less likely you are to engage in the behavior of suicide. Okay, who's the guy that came up with the term sociology? Yeah, somebody said it. Comte, Auguste Comte is the guy that coined the term sociology. Most of these guys are European also, when we look at them. So know that some of their names are pronounced a little different than they look. In 1848, there was a guy that wrote the Communist Manifesto. That book became the basis of communism and conflict theory. What's his name? Karl Marx. Karl Marx, you'll hear his name a lot in government and history as well. So he's the main conflict theorist. Who's the guy that developed the theory of self? And when he identified the self, he basically said it includes an element of how you interpret others' interpretation of you. No, not Freud. Mead is the guy that came up with that theory of self. So that's an SI analysis, right? Okay, who's the guy that came up with the idea of the looking glass self, specifically? Yeah, C.H. Cooley. Good. Okay. All right, what's the difference between high culture and pop culture? High culture and pop culture.
High culture is the upper class people, and the other one is majority. Right?
Yep. So high culture are cultural patterns that are common for the elite in society, whereas pop culture is what's popular with everybody. So McDonald's, would that be high culture or pop culture? Pop culture. I don't know. Some 5-star restaurant that's only in a specific town, high culture, right? Caviar. What's that an example of? High culture. I don't know. Bugattis. Bugattis, that's a elite sports car. High culture. Ford Explorers. Pop culture. Okay, you guys get the idea for that. Okay, what's the difference between a subculture and a counterculture? Subculture and a counterculture, what's the difference? Counterculture and subculture. Okay. Yeah, a subculture is a sub-element within a larger culture. Okay, good. So how does that differ from a counterculture?
The counterculture challenges culture.
Yep. A counterculture is a type of subculture. It specifically is one that challenges the larger culture. So you can be a subculture that doesn't challenge the assumptions of the culture as a whole. For example, we've got the culture of West Fargo Public Schools. You can break that down into West Fargo High School or Cheyenne High School, either way. So you break that down, you've got different subcultures within the school. People that are in volleyball, people that are in football, people that are in whatever play, people that are in choir, right? Those are subcultures. Those cultures don't challenge the values of the school though. But there's also subcultures within the high school student body that challenge or go against what the school would like, right? So if you have a group of, like from the movie today, the stoners, right? Or burned out wannabes or whatever they call them, right? Okay, that would be a counterculture, okay? It's also a subculture, but it's a counterculture. Okay, Freud talked about 3 aspects of his personality. In Freud's view, what are those 3 parts of the personality? Id, superego, and ego. Which one is the one that wants instant gratification and is driven by pleasure? The id. What's the internalized norms of society that functions as your conscience? Superego. What's the person in the middle? Ego. Okay, so the devil-angel analogy from cartoons. The devil's the id, the angel's the superego, person in the middle is the ego.
Wait, so superego is conscious mind? I thought that was
Not conscious, conscience. Like the thing in you that feels bad if you do bad things. Not that you're awake. Okay? All right. Prisons and mental hospitals are examples of this type of institution. Total institution, where they want to re-socialize you. Yeah. Okay. Another theorist we talked about 3 levels of moral development. That guy's name was Lawrence Kohlberg. What were those 3 levels called? Moral development. Pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. In pre-conventional, what determines your belief about morality? Pre-conventional, feelings, what feels good to you. Conventional, based on what? Rules, yep. So it's based on rules. And then post-conventional?
Abstract.
Abstract values of goodness. Yep, good. Another theorist we talked about was Jean Piaget. Piaget's theory was on cognitive development. Piaget was on cognitive development. What's his first stage called?
Motor stage.
Sensory motor. And that's where people just respond to stimulus in their environment. Second stage?
Operational stage.
Pre-operational. What are you doing in that stage?
Use language and other symbols.
That's where you first start using language and other symbols. Good. Third stage?
Concrete operational.
Concrete. That's where you first see causation, right? C and C. That's how I remember that. And also, what's the third letter in the alphabet? C. Right? So that's how I remember those things. And then the last stage is? Last stage is formal, and that's where you can start to think abstractly and critically. Good. Okay, let's talk about role, status, role set, status set, described, achieved, all that stuff. And I'll use me as an example now. Teacher, husband, father, those are all examples of what? Statuses. Okay? Would those that I just gave you, teacher, husband, father, would those be ascribed or achieved? Achieved, because I had a measure of choice in that, right? Okay? Male or brother, what type of status would that be? Ascribed, because I didn't have a choice. Okay? Now, I'm a teacher. Part of my rules for that are being like an expert in the content, and then paperwork, discipline, stuff like that, right? So the rules are the expected behavior. I think that got on film. I don't know. Okay. What's all of my statuses together called?
Status set.
Status set. What is the status that shapes me the most called? Master status. Good. What are all the expected behaviors related to a single status called? Role set. Okay. Now, right now, my wife is trying to put my kids to bed, but I am helping you study. So I'm experiencing what right now? Role conflict, because it's two statuses getting in the way of each other. If I'm at home and my daughter's like, "Daddy, please snuggle with me a little bit. I just miss you and I'm afraid." Okay? But I'm like wanting to do that. I want to snuggle with her, but I'm also like, you need to go to bed at a decent time. What's that an example of? Role strain, because it's roles within a single status. Okay? Okay. What's the study of death and dying called? Close. Gerontology. Okay, good. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is one of the people that talked about that. She talked about what she called the 5 stages of death and dying. 5 stages of death and dying, which you can remember by thinking of the acronym DABDA, D-A-B-D-A. So, first stage, denial. Second stage, anger. Third stage, bargaining. Fourth stage, depression. And last stage, acceptance. Okay? We also talked about a theory known as dramaturgy. In dramaturgy, what do they believe we all are, basically? We're all basically actors. Okay, we also, another theory we talked about in the SI perspective was ethnomethodology. What do ethnomethodologists do?
Your surroundings.
Yeah, how do they study surroundings, though?
They like break norms.
Break norms and then see what happens, see how people respond. And in that whole interaction of norm breaking and how people respond, that's how you really learn what's important in society. Okay. 2 other theories that we talked about were the Thomas theorem and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So let me give you an example of each and let's see if you can get it right. we walk in, let's say we came in here and we all like reek like smoke and we're dressed like real bad and we're like, we just look like a real tough crowd, right? Okay, but in reality we're like really nice people. We just have like this, we like went and helped people that were homeless that all smoke or something, so we smell like that, okay? Whatever. But we look like this rough crowd, so we get kicked out, okay? What's that an example of? Thomas theorem, because we'd be perceived to be a rough crowd even though we weren't, right? So what's perceived as real is real in its consequences. And that's what the Thomas theorem states. Examples of that could be a variety of different things. I think the quiz question I had was something like, pastor comes in, he's got a suit on, CEO, president of a bank comes in, baggy clothes, backwards hat. The president gets less attention than the pastor from salespeople, even though he has way more money than the pastor. That's because of the W.I. Thomas theorem. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis talks about language and how language is essential to understanding our world. So the more words, to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the more words people have related to something or a culture has related to something, the more that they value it. And the more people can think more deeply about it as well. Okay. We also discussed 3 different ways to study sociology. Each of these ways relates to a specific theory. So those 3 ways are positivist or scientific, interpretive, and critical. The positivist, which of the 3 main theories does that associate with? Functionalism, conflict, or SI? Functionalism. Okay. Interpretive is associated mostly with what? SI. And then critical is mostly associated with what? Conflict theory. Good. Okay. One of the early theorists in sociology was a guy named Peter Berger. He talked about how we try to see the general patterns of people's behavior in particular instances of individuals. So earlier I talked about deductive and inductive logic. Deductive is going from the general to the specific. Inductive is specific to general. So I think the example I gave is like the old couple that goes to the same church as my wife and I. Unfortunately, the lady passed away, but they come up and then you see like he likes hobbling, but he's still doing everything he can to help his wife. He's trying to hold the door for her, he's fixing her hair, he's doing all these sweet things. So I see that specific instance, and then I can go more broadly and say love exists, right? So Berger is one of the guys that pointed out how we can do that, go from the general to the particular. Who was the person again that studied suicide in Europe? Suicide in Europe? Durkheim is correct, okay? Also, we talked about where sociology started. What continent did sociology start as a discipline? Started in Europe, specifically. The blenders? Can you hear? Not really. You can move if you need to. Yeah, okay. I can try to talk louder too, but... okay. If you're androcentric in your research, what does that mean? If you're androcentric in your research, what does that mean? Andro is a prefix that basically means male. So if you're androcentric, you're approaching things from a male perspective. What if your research or your culture is Eurocentric? What does that mean? You're focused on European society or values rather than other ones. Some of the other things we talked about were social isolation. I remember Jeannie and Anna. We watched a little video clip on Jeannie, and then we saw in the text they talked about Anna. Both of those girls were, for a variety of reasons, left away from society. They were abused and not taught stuff, right? So in those instances, they found eventually that it was basically impossible to socialize those people, right? What was especially hard for them? What couldn't they learn? Like they tried and tried and tried to get them to learn this, but it was almost impossible. To talk, yeah, language specifically. So the idea was that it led to this critical period where if you don't learn how to talk in like a specific window, you're gonna run into problems. If you, these are hard to kind of reword on the fly. Yeah, that's, anytime I say that, that's what people usually say. But, okay. If you commit a bunch of crimes, you get sent to prison, you have a mental disorder, you're at a mental institution. When they're trying to re-socialize you, one of the first things that they'll do is try to break down your previous identity, right? What's the institution that all takes place in? What's that called? Total institution. So that's really regimented, right? It's like they control every part of your day. Okay, when Mead talked about the self, what did he mean when he discussed the term the self? What did he mean in the self? Is the self like the id, like Freud thought? To Mead, is that what the self is? No. So to Mead, it's the self is the part of your personality that has a self-awareness and a self-image. So it's aware that you exist largely in society about how others see you. We also talked about that concept of the looking glass self, remember? So the key variable in that, I talked about this and gave it as an example in class about how when you meet somebody, you're like, hey, you talk to them, you put your hand out, and then you kind of try to read them, like how do they respond? So in the concept of the looking glass self, we basically see ourselves as others see us, or at least as we think others see us. So that's the key variable with that we see ourselves the way we think others see us. In the chapter on socialization, I talked about growing up, becoming an adult. What's the variable that most researchers point as being the most important thing for being an adult? The most important thing for being an adult. Is it like graduating high school? Is it having a job? Is it, what would it be? Yeah, which major accomplishment? No. Living independent of your family. That's the thing that the text identified as the most important. Okay, we also talked about the concept of the social construction of reality, how we interpret things, and that's a large part of what we believe is true. The key to that aspect, again, of the social construction of reality is trying to get people and read people. So give me some examples of common interactions that you have where you have to try to read people.
When you're flirting with someone.
Okay, the text identified flirting, right? So some people interpret that really badly, right? So you wave at somebody and then they look at you and they think you're weird and you intend to flirt with them. Or you might like ignore them and they might interpret that as a flirt also. So it is all this big process of trying to like work out what's real and what's not real. So if you look at flirting, nobody uses the same strategy. They might use some common strategies, but different people do different things. Some people might like be extra close to somebody and touch them a lot. Some people might kind of ignore them. It just depends on like their interpretation of what they should do. Okay, good. We also talked about dishonesty and how to read that. What are a couple things that you would look for in social clues with dishonesty? Eye contact, fidgeting,
Like if they repeat something.
repetitiveness. Basically anything that strays from how they normally would act. But nonverbal cues are the big thing you'd be looking for. Yep. We did a lot of analysis on humor. When we study humor, that's largely an SI analysis. But what's the key to understand in humor?
Different perspectives.
Okay, knowing the background,
Understanding both realities.
knowing both the realities that are being presented. And the further apart those realities are, without like crossing a line, the funnier something is perceived. Okay, we also talked about how functionalists view humor. From a functionalist perspective, what does humor do? Not from a functionalist perspective. From a conflict perspective, it is. That relieves stress. Relieves stress, and it allows us to talk about concepts that are too stressful to discuss otherwise. From a conflict perspective, Brianna, jokes are a way that people will put down others that don't have as much power as them. The first assignment we played the game of MASH. What was that showing us? What did that help us to see? Norms and how social experiences shape a lot of our decisions. Yep. What's the key difference between SI and functionalism? Micro macro is the key difference. Yep, between those two. Okay, you guys came here to learn in part, and then also to get the bonus points probably, right? But let's say also while you were here, you like met a new friend. You didn't intend to meet them, right? So what would that be an example of? Latent function. Yep. Okay. If we have a pattern of interaction in society that continues over time, functionalists would say that that's functional. It has to be functional because it continues. So on the flip side, functionalists also believe that if something is dysfunctional, inevitably or eventually it'll quit happening. Okay? So if it's dysfunctional, it's producing a social dysfunction, there will be basically no more demand for it to happen in society. Okay. Which of the main perspectives in sociology believes that we want to look at competition between different groups? No, which of the three main perspectives would say we focus on competition between groups? Functionalism, conflict, or SI? Conflict, yep, not a counterculture. Yep. Which theory looks at society as an organism? Functionalism. Which theory would look at how like people on a committee try to understand a situation and then make a decision based on the situation they're in? SI. It's a smaller group, right? They're looking at a committee. So that'd be SI. We also talked about conformity. There were two main studies we discussed with conformity. One was the shock study. Who did the shock study? Who did the shock study? Stanley Milgram. So he found that if there was an expert there, then people would go on and shock people, right? Who was the guy that did the line study? The line study for conformity. Or the Solomon Asch, yep. So in Solomon Asch's study, the video we watched talked about some of the variables which affected the likelihood that people would challenge the rest of the group. What was one of the variables that was discussed that would make it more likely that people would go against the group? When they were pointing out the different line lengths. How many people were there? What else? How many people went before them? Yeah, if they wrote it down instead of having to say it. Okay, so those are all examples where the pressure kind of went down. Yep. What's a group that has 2 people in it called? Dyad, 3 people? Okay. In a group of 3, how many relationships from a sociological perspective do you have? Yeah, like 6, right? So it's not just the number of people, because you can have like one person relating to 4 people, you can get bigger. Okay. Let's say we have a guy that lives in West Fargo, and he is a computer programmer, and he's got a wife, and he is a Catholic guy, and he has 14 kids. Okay? What status probably is his master status? Father probably is his master status. So how do you determine what the master status is in part then? How much time it takes, and also like how it's outside the norm it is, right? If it's really, really outside the norm of the community you're in, then it's probably going to be your master status. Because it makes you a lot different than everybody else, right? There's like that section, I give you a scenario, and I have you identify a whole bunch of terms. So it's similar to that. I'm not going to give you the exact scenario, but it's like Bill has this many kids, and he does this, and he relates to this, and all that. Which of the following is his status, okay? Okay. We talked about leadership styles. What are the 3 leadership styles? 3 leadership styles. Okay, instrumental, expressive, and authoritarian. Well, authoritarian, democratic, and laissez-faire are the 3 leadership types. Leadership styles, I should say, would be instrumental, expressive. Yep. So instrumental is like getting stuff done, and then expressive is feelings based. So in authoritarian leadership, you don't look for feedback from anybody else. In laissez-faire, you don't care what happens. In democratic, you seek feedback from everybody else. Out of authoritarian, laissez-faire, and democratic, which is the most effective over time? Democratic. In stressful situations, when decisions need to be made, which one's the most effective? Authoritarian. Okay. I went over probably about 80% of kind of what's going to be on there. Does anybody have any specific questions? If you want to leave at this time, you can, and then make sure you sign on the sheet. If you want to stick around, I'm going to stop recording now, but if you want to stick around and ask me specific questions, you can. I'll stick around for probably about 15 more minutes, okay? So go ahead and turn it off.